Well, as much as Atalanta was a tough game for Arsenal last week, this felt like the big heavyweight clash for them at home against PSG. A PSG that's in a little bit of transition, coming away from of the sort of super name star power team they had previously with Mbappe, with Messi, with Neymar, and this feels like now a bit of an embryo that they can craft into something that is going to resemble more of a team that can go on and accomplish something in Europe. Obviously, they win the French league every year. That's neither here nor there for them, really. That they'll always win it. And if it's a 10-year span, they'll win it probably 7 or 8 out of 10 times, with the level of recruitment contrasted to the rest of the league. But this team needs to make a big statement in Europe, and while I don't think they're there yet, I like a lot of what I see from this PSG team. I think there's a certain bit of development with certain players, and it does need some recruitment added to it as time goes on, but nothing dramatic. Just little bits dropped in here and there, which I'll sort of highlight as I go and discuss this team in and out of possession. And Arsenal showing every bit of quality they have, which is a lot of qualities. Such a high level, versatile team, technically, attacking wise, defensively, and they kept PSG out throughout all the zones, and it was a really professional, well-rounded performance from Arsenal. And you have to give them a lot of credit for the way they pulled their game plan off. But we'll go over the Arsenal attacking shape first. So the issue that PSG had with Arsenal, and I don't think they planned well enough for, and I don't think they have the quality within that midfield to be able to adapt with, is Arsenal's build-up shape is so flexible, it's so rotational, and they're not confined to a specific shape when they build up. It can be a 2-4, it can be a 3-2, it can be a 2-3, it can even be a 4-3 in certain circumstances. They've got so many just sort of tactically intelligent players to adapt, and that comes from the coaching team to be able to instill triggers into how an opposition presses is the time when you move into this specific shape, or a player moves into this position. And I feel like there's a lot of freedom for certain players to take up positions that then the entire team has to react to. And PSG just weren't comfortable adapting to it, and they got played through quite a few times. I think their original shape was to defend against the 2-4-4, and that would be with Zaire Emery and Neves pressing up onto Rice and Partey, Barcola and Dewey onto the two fullbacks, with Lee sort of moving in between the two centre backs, which he was having to face a bit of a tougher task because Raya gets involved in those build-up stages, and it can create a 3-on-1. But to be fair to PSG, I don't think they were as upset about Arsenal having the ball in these positions, as that was never really where they were going to be hurt. So Lee would sort of move in between Marcus, trying to shadow the pass into Saliba if it went to Raya. So he'd then have to play the pass to Gabriel, and then Lee could go across and then cut those lanes out into both of them. He could manage that well. Vitinha would sit in between the lines on Leandro Trossard, Hakimi and Mendes on the two wingers, and Pacho could move across and engage Havertz, as we know Havertz likes to drop deep. The issue with this was when these rotations started happening. So sometimes you'd get Trossard moving across to allow Declan Rice to move up into this position. Emery would then be caught in this position. Does he stay in this area here and fill that gap, or move back with Rice? Calafiori could then come into the centre midfield position, and again, this would create an issue for Dewey. Does he remain out wide? Does he maybe come into Gabriel, or does he follow Calafiori in and let Zaire Emery move on to him? And there was that real lack of midfield general, that's a leader, I guess, in that midfield. It's not even so much leader, because I feel like the role of a leader gets a little bit misconstrued at points, but a defensively minded player that could sit in the base, that could just sort of instruct everyone around. It felt like Zaire Emery and Neves and Vitinha, who were three technically fantastic players, by the way, and they are really good players, and they're not bad defenders when they're pressing, but it felt like they all needed a bit of help. It felt like they all needed a bit of guidance. Vitinha does really well in that holding midfield position as a stopgap, but he isn't elite. He isn't going to win you the big trophies in Europe. And it wouldn't just be Calafiori doing this, to be fair. It could be anything. It could be Timber coming inside to push Partey along, and Saka could maybe drop into this position. Trossard could maybe come in a little bit deeper if Arsenal were in their sort of 4-1-2-3 shape, to receive it here alongside Rice. So there's so many subtle movements. And to be fair, one thing that Arsenal did really well was if Partey dropped into this position a little bit deeper to receive the ball from Raya or Gabriel, Saliba could move up into this area here, with the idea that Neves was getting drawn to Partey. Gabriel could get on the ball, or Raya. If Partey was to play it back to him, they could slip a ball into Saliba, who could drive with the ball forward and play forward and set Arsenal on their way. And again, as I was speaking about before, these were the moments that PSG struggled to react to. And Arsenal's main threat to get the ball up the field would be through one of two ways. One, it would be through Timber dropping in maybe a little bit, suckering Barcola onto him. Saka could then come in a little bit deeper, bringing Nuno Mendes on with him, and he could play the ball to him and either play it sideways or look to get on the ball, get on the half turn, and take it round Nuno Mendes, which he did a number of times. There was a battle between those two, and Saka won the vast majority of them. Nuno Mendes really struggled in that fullback position. He's not a terrible defender, Nuno Mendes, but against a player like Saka in the form that Saka's in, that is a hard contest for him to deal with. And he kept getting suckered in too tight, and he wasn't dealing with him well enough 1v1. Or with the way that Arsenal would look to play out when they try and build up on that right hand side, that was their favoured side in building up. Partey could come across, maybe Rice could come in a little bit. Zaire Emery could get dragged in. And with Trossard taking up this position in the 10, he had a bit more freedom. Havertz would naturally drop in. This gave the invitation for either Declan Rice or Calafiori to move up into this sort of left attacking midfield position to outnumber that area. So if they could beat that initial press, so let's just say Calafiori coming inside, Zaire Emery getting caught to him, Dewey coming on to Gabriel, getting switched across to this position, if they could find that pass into David Raya or another free man, then that pass could go into Declan Rice. It could maybe even come into Martinelli if he dropped into this position here, who could then switch it across to this player. Or if there wasn't the player there and it was just Trossard and Havertz, maybe Vitinha could get drawn into this area to protect that space that Hakimi could potentially leave by going to engage with Martinelli, and Trossard could then receive it in these areas here and look to create, or Havertz could as well. And the beauty of it being, say, a Trossard plus Rice or Calafiori in this area is because Vitinha was marking Trossard, that left this right half space free. Now, Hakimi couldn't go because he was man marking Martinelli, and Marquinhos couldn't really go and commit because Martinelli would drag Hakimi quite wide. He was told to stay to that touchline as much as he possibly could. And Marquinhos had to manage that space. And with Trossard, with Havertz, with Rice, you don't have quick players, but you have players that are powerful runners and can move off of their mark as well into these areas. And sometimes a powerful stride is more effective than a quick stride. So he couldn't risk leaving that space free. So he was caught in a bit of no man's land at point. And being partnered with William Pacho, who's been a really good signing for PSG, by the way. He was tasked with engaging Havertz in these areas if he went to drop in. Marquinhos had to be ready with the two players either side of him, Hakimi, Pacho, and be ready to cover the space that they could leave with those players dropping in. And so with Rice maybe getting the ball in this position, Vitinha having to sort of come across for two players, that meant that the defence had to come across a little bit in these areas. Mendes would maybe get dragged in a little bit more narrow. And this created the pass for anyone in that central area to find Saka on this right-hand side, who was left one-on-one with Mendes because of the quick switch of play. And as the possession moved further up for Arsenal, with Saka driving at Mendes one-on-one, however PSG could look to maybe double up on Saka, Arsenal had a plan for. Pacho was tasked with Havertz, and Havertz would make these runs underlapping in the middle to drag Pacho with him, and Timber could overlap to bring Barcola with him. Not so much even to get the ball, Jury and Timber, but just to create that overlapping run that created more space for Saka to drive at Mendes and move one-on-one against him, either inside or down the line into the box to get a goal-scoring opportunity, whether that's through himself or playing it to a teammate. And the issue is with Arsenal, sometimes you make a tactical foul to slow the game down, and Arsenal is still as effective in those areas. They're one of the best set-piece teams in the world and are more than capable of getting goals that way. But how did PSG look to attack? We'll go over that now. So PSG would look to build up in a sort of 2-4-4 that could turn into a 2-5-3 with Zaire Emery dropping into the midfield three. Arsenal initially would press high, they'd be aggressive, and they'd look to prevent PSG playing through as quick as possible. Havertz would come onto William Pacho, Trossard onto Marquinhos, Rice and Partey onto Vitinha and João Neves, Saka onto Nuno Mendes. Martinelli would start on Hakimi but would move into Zaire Emery as the build-up for PSG would look to favour the left-hand side. And because of the aggressiveness in which Arsenal pressed with, that quick switch of play over to Hakimi on the right-hand side was never really available, and they couldn't unlock it quickly enough to really hurt Arsenal. Calafiori and Timber on the two wingers, and Saliba and Gabriel with more Saliba on Lee Kang-in. And Lee Kang-in played a very interesting role, and this PSG team played without a striker, which added to a lot more midfield fluidity, a lot more combinations within that sections, but a real lack of a focal point. But typically they'd look to play with the five in the middle as Zire Dewey looked to come inside, maybe dragging Calafiori with him, and Hakimi could attack that space down the right and provide the width. And so those five in the midfield for Arsenal had to be really well managed. And they did so by preventing them from playing early on, by pressing and being aggressive and preventing that midfield overload from really coming to hurt him. Dewey wouldn't be so much as involved in the build-up because he'd be coming from the right into the middle slowly. And when you're favouring the left side of build-up, you're not going to really see time on the ball in those deeper stages. But Lee Kang-in could come in and he could rotate with Neves on this left-hand side and drop in alongside Vitinha to look to get on the ball and help progress from these deeper areas. But Saliba would leave the defensive line to engage in these areas and even past the likes of Rice and Partey to stop Lee from getting on the ball and playing. The issue with this strikerless formations I sometimes find is that as much as you can win those midfield battles and it gives you a higher chance of doing so, you need wide players to exploit what happens when that happens. And this is what I was speaking about the other day with Xerxes in United. Xerxes drops deep, Garnacho and Ahmad stay wide, and then no one's attacking the centre area of the pitch. You've only really got Barcola who would look to swing in behind and potentially exploit that space that PSG could open up. Gabriel's really good with his positioning, but he can get caught, obviously, with the amount of space he's having to deal with. And Timber, to be fair, defended Barcola excellently in this side, getting back, contesting him well. And I thought Timber had a fantastic game in that first half. He gets better every time I see him, Timber. He's so versatile, but so high quality. I think I was saying this about Manuel Akanji the other day as well. Versatile players I almost find a bit, I'm not going to say overrated because every team wants them. I always find a player is typically versatile because they're not really good enough in any one position. These are players that are versatile but are top quality in every role they play. If you could look at Timber's positioning on Football Manager, there's probably every position with some degree of colour. Calafiori would get dragged into Desiree Due, but again, Desiree Due would typically stay at best in this right half space. But with the technical quality of this PSG team and with the fluidity that existed within it, they could play out. And sometimes you could see it in this right half space if Zaire Emery was free, if Martinelli couldn't come across quick enough, and Donnarumma could play the ball through, and it would push Arsenal back into shape. But what would that shape look like? Arsenal again won't labour on it because I feel like I've mentioned it every time I've spoken about them in big games. Great high press, great low block. They work between the two systems well and they transition well. Great physical engines in that midfield and wide areas to really get back quick and prevent that space. That if it does get opened up, which it can happen in a game of football, they can shut it off immediately. And to be fair, PSG's fluidity and their flexibility with the system they were playing was very good. I say technically, they've got a very high-profile team in that regard. Dewey would typically come into the right half space. Hakimi would overlap on the right. Zaire Emery, Neves, and Barcola in these areas with Lee Kang-in dropping in, creating just a real overload in those central areas. Vitinha would link that to the back three, which would have Nuno Mendes tucking in to form it. And Nuno Mendes, this is kind of one of the issues I was speaking about at the start of the video with PSG. Nuno Mendes is a fantastic player and he's a good attacker, and there's a lot about him I like. Is he the right profile for this left centre-back position, which you kind of need because Hakimi drives forward, he's an attacking player and will look to overlap on that right-hand side or even underlap. And so you need that covering. That Luis Enrique is in the position, he's too good to leave out, but he's not really good enough to fulfill a role that's needed for the team and can get caught in transition in these areas. And that is going to be an issue when you play with one between the lines. To be fair, Trossard and Havertz wouldn't look to go and engage with that back three. They'd stay on Vitinha, they'd try and block the early pass. And Arsenal's midfield will narrow up to make sure that they're not getting played through in that midfield. So you maybe get Martinelli coming into Desiree Due there. You'd get Rice onto Zaire Emery. You'd get Partey onto Lee Kang-in, and then you get Saka coming across here into João Neves. And so they compact, they make those central areas really hard to play through for PSG. And even if there were occasions where, let's say, Rice got caught maybe pressing if he came to Vitinha, or if he felt like there was an opportunity to do so, or he just got pulled a little bit higher up, and Zaire Emery or Lee Kang-in could pull into this position, then Gabriel and Saliba would be responsible enough to go in and press and just make sure that there was still that compactness, and they were restricting PSG's ability to play through central areas. Only opportunities that PSG could really create in these areas was on that right-hand side. Now, Calafiori has had a couple tough games for Arsenal. I think that's being fair, in that he's getting pulled in too close to his wide player. So let's say Hakimi here, he's getting pulled in too close, and it's a quick pass inside to Dewey, and Hakimi can then turn and overlap against Calafiori on his right-hand side, and the ball is played through. And that happened to Calafiori a couple times against Dewey and against Hakimi, losing the sprint battle up against him on his right-hand side. And he does lack that burst. He isn't quick, and a quick wide player can get in behind him because he doesn't give himself the best opportunity of covering that space because he's too quick to engage with the player. And it's fine engaging, by the way. If this space opens up to Hakimi, he's got every right to go and go and close that a bit, but it's the fact that he goes in far too tight and far too aggressively. He doesn't manage it. He doesn't jockey with him one-on-one. It's too easy. Whereas then, if he's just giving himself a yard or two of space, Hakimi can play that ball into Dewey or into Lee Kang in, and then Calafiori can quickly drop in and just use that extra yard or two to prevent that from becoming an issue and defend it well. Again, he's young and he's got a lot of learning to do, Calafiori, but it's just an issue that's going to keep getting exploited and caught out. And there was technical quality in between the lines, to be fair, from PSG. Lee Kang-in, I thought, was really good in finding those openings, and maybe if Arsenal's space was quite narrow, let's say Timber and Calafiori coming in, he could use his passing ability to switch the play. João Neves did it a few times as well. Desiree Dewey is good with those cute little passes in between the lines. There was times where they opened up, but Arsenal, they defend well compactly, horizontally, and get in the box to defend the box well. And you have to give Declan Rice and Partey credit, because not only can Gabriel and Saliba engage in these areas if the space gets opened up, if it does get played in behind them, they're fantastic athletes and fantastic physical presences that can quickly chase back and put pressure on the player on the ball in these positions. So again, just really tough and difficult for PSG to play through. And in the second half, when PSG were getting more of the ball and Arsenal was sitting off, protecting the 2-0 lead, Martinelli and Saka can fall into these fullback positions and just make it so much harder for PSG to break through. And they frustrated them, they kept them out, and they earned their 2-0 win. Fantastic performance from Arsenal. Really, really confident and controlled and composed. And full credit to him, full credit to Mikel Arteta. It was a good win, and it felt like they needed something after that Atalanta game to just give that Champions League stint for them a bit of a boost, because they can't afford to get knocked out early this year for me, Arsenal. They have to make a really good go in the cup competitions. He's lost that pass for me, in my opinion, Arteta, to go out in cup competitions so early. Let's see how this carries on going forward. But again, PSG, you can be hopeful for not maybe this season, but in years to come. There's something building there. High level technical quality players, young players that are going to develop and get better year on year. But I'd love to know what you guys think. Like the video if you like it, dislike it if you disliked it. Comment down below and tell me why either way. Subscribe if you want to see more, and I'll see you next time. In a bit, lads.